On the morning of February 26th, 1931, a man named Joe Masseria sat down to lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island, Brooklyn. He was the most powerful mafia boss in the United States. He had survived 3 assassination attempts. He had outlasted every rival who had come at him directly. He trusted the man who had invited him to lunch that afternoon completely. That man was Charles Luciano. Masseria was still eating when 4 men walked in and shot him 10 times. When police arrived, they found him dead on the floor, still holding a playing card in his hand. Charles Luciano was in the men's room. He had seen nothing. Within months, the American Mafia would be reorganized from the ground up. The commission would be established. The 5 families of New York would be formalized. And the modern structure of Italian-American organized crime, the structure that federal prosecutors would spend the next 60 years dismantling, would exist almost entirely because of what Charles Luciano had built and planned in the decade before that lunch. Tonight, 7 things documented in the federal and historical record about Lucky Luciano's rise to power. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description, drawn from Selwyn Rabb's 5 Families, Tim Newark's Luciano, The Real and the Fake Godfather, the 1936 trial record in People versus Luciano, the Kefauver Committee transcripts of 1950 and 1951, and FBI file 92-HQ-1118. Number 7. He was not born. Lucky Luciano. The man the world knows as Lucky Luciano was born, Salvatore Lucania, on November 24th, 1897, in Leccara Friddi, a sulfur mining town in the interior of Sicily. He was not American by birth, not Lucky by name, and not Luciano by any legal document that existed during his rise. His family arrived in New York in 1907. He was 9 years old. They settled on the Lower East Side, on blocks becoming home to the largest concentration of Sicilian immigrants in the United States. By 1911, at 14, Salvatore Lucania had his first arrest for shoplifting. By 1916, his first drug conviction, heroin carrying, for which he served time. The name change has no single documented origin. According to Tim Newark's research, Luciano appears to have been adopted as a street alias in the early 1920s, partly to distance himself from the arrest records attached to Lucania, partly as operational cover in a criminal underworld where known names drew police attention. Lucky appears in documented police records by approximately 1923. Its precise origin is disputed. One documented account attributes it to his survival of a 1929 attack in which he was kidnapped, beaten, and left for dead on Staten Island. Other documented accounts place the nickname earlier. What the record confirms: the man who restructured the American Mafia did so under an assumed identity, having entered the country as an immigrant child, built his early criminal record under his birth name, and reinvented himself, in name and in strategy, before he was 30. The renaming was the first reorganization. It would not be the last. Number 6. He built his power through a Jewish criminal partnership. The old guard considered a threat. The Sicilian and Italian mob culture of the early 20th century operated on a documented principle. Organizational loyalty was ethnic loyalty. You worked with Italians. You trusted Italians. Deep operational partnerships with Jewish or Irish gangsters were considered a violation of tradition and, in the old guard's view, a security risk. Luciano violated this systematically, deliberately, and at personal risk. By the early 1920s, he had formed a working partnership with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, both Jewish, both operating on the Lower East Side, both younger than the established Sicilian bosses running New York organized crime. The partnership was operational from the start. Lansky's documented financial sophistication, Siegel's documented capacity for violence, and Luciano's organizational discipline formed a combination none of the three could have built independently. According to Selwyn Rabb's documented account in 5 Families, this partnership allowed Luciano to operate bootlegging distribution networks at a scale and efficiency that traditional ethnic silo operations could not match. Raab documents that Luciano's mid-1920s bootlegging revenue ran substantially higher than that of bosses with more formal organizational standing, precisely because his distribution network crossed ethnic lines. The established Sicilian bosses, including Masseria, were aware of these alliances and considered them a violation. FBI surveillance documents from the late 1920s confirm that Luciano's cross-ethnic partnerships were a documented friction point with the old guard leadership. Masseria tolerated it because Luciano was producing revenue. He never fully accepted it. That tolerance would cost him his life. Number 5. He survived a murder attempt and turned it into a strategic asset. On the night of October 16th or 17th, 1929, the precise date appears inconsistently across sources, with the 17th appearing in the majority of federal records. Charles Luciano was abducted from a New York street, forced into a vehicle, driven to Staten Island, and beaten severely. His throat was cut. He was left for dead on a beach. He was found alive the following morning. The attack is documented in New York Police Department records, in FBI file materials, and referenced in both Raab's 5 families and Newark's research. The perpetrators were never definitively identified in any federal proceeding. Multiple cooperating witnesses in subsequent years attributed the attack to Masseria associates, who had grown concerned about Luciano's expanding power and his cross-ethnic alliances. What the record documents is what Luciano did afterward. He did not retaliate immediately. He did not identify his attackers to police. He did not use the attack to justify an open break with Masseria. According to Raab's documented account, Luciano absorbed the attack, allowed it to generate the lucky mythology, the man no one could kill, and continued building his position within the Masseria organization, while simultaneously making covert contact with Masseria's rival, Salvatore Maranzano. Federal prosecutors who later built cases against Luciano described this period in court filings as evidence of unusual organizational discipline, the capacity to absorb violence without letting it alter the long-term plan. The attack, in other words, became an asset. The man who survived what he wasn't supposed to survive became more feared, more mythologized, more valuable inside the organization that had tried to kill him. The long-term plan was already in place before anyone cut his throat. Number 4. The Castellammarese War was not the conflict he fought. It was the one he managed. The Castellammarese War of 1930 to 1931 is documented in the K-Forver Committee hearings, FBI surveillance files, and Raab's 5 families as one of the most consequential internal conflicts in the history of American organized crime. A war between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, who had arrived from Sicily with ambitions to dominate all of American organized crime, that left bodies across New York for over a year. The standard account presents Luciano as the man who ended the war by orchestrating Masseria's murder. The documented record is more precise than that. According to Raab's account, Luciano had been in covert contact with Maranzano before Masseria's murder, negotiating the terms of a peace, and specifically negotiating his own position in the post-war reorganization, in exchange for delivering Masseria. The invitation to the Coney Island lunch on February 26, 1931, was not an impulsive act of treachery. It was the conclusion of a documented negotiation Luciano had conducted with the enemy while still nominally serving his boss. FBI records and subsequent cooperator testimony confirm that Luciano arranged the shooters, identified in various accounts as Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel, and arranged his own alibi before the lunch began. 5 months later, Luciano executed the second half of the plan. Salvatore Maranzano, who had declared himself boss of bosses and had already drawn up a list of figures he intended to have killed, including Luciano, was murdered in his Park Avenue office on September 10, 1931. The men who killed him were identified in federal records as associates of the Luciano Lansky network. In 9 months, Luciano had eliminated both sides of a war he had formerly served on one side of. The Castellammarese War was not the conflict he fought. It was the instrument he used. Number 3. The Commission was not a peace agreement. It was a corporate restructuring. The Commission, established by Luciano in late 1931, following Maranzano's murder, is documented in the Kiefover Committee transcripts, FBI surveillance files, and RAB's 5 families as the governing body of American organized crime, a board of directors, in federal prosecutors' language, that arbitrated disputes between families and authorized major criminal decisions, including sanctioned murders. What is less widely understood is what the commission was specifically designed to prevent. Both Masseria and Maranzano had claimed the title of boss of bosses, supreme authority over all of organized crime. Both had been murdered for holding it. According to Rayab's documented account, Luciano specifically and deliberately abolished that title. The commission was structured to ensure that no single individual could occupy the position that both predecessors had held and died holding. The 5 families of New York were formalized, each with its own boss, its own structure, its own territory, all subject to commission arbitration. Chicago and other major outfits were represented. The structure created a distributed governance model specifically designed to make the organization more resilient than any individual leader. This is documented in the federal proceedings of the 1985 Commission case brought by the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, United States versus Salerno, in which the federal court established on the record that the commission existed as a functioning governing body with documented decision-making authority. The prosecution traced the organization's origin to Luciano's 1931 restructuring. The man who abolished the boss of bosses title became, in functional terms, the most powerful figure in American organized crime, precisely because he had built a system with no formal, most powerful figure. Federal prosecutors spent 30 years trying to prove the commission existed. Luciano had spent 1 year building it to survive 30 years of federal attention. Number 2, he was convicted on unprecedented charges and reorganized his operation from prison. On June 7, 1936, Charles Luciano was convicted in New York State Supreme Court in People versus Luciano on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison. He was 38 years old. The prosecution was brought by Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, built largely on testimony from women who worked in prostitution operations. The prosecution attributed to Luciano's organization. The conviction is contested in the historical record. Luciano denied direct involvement in prostitution operations for the rest of his life, and Rab's documented account acknowledges the prosecutorial method was aggressive and the cooperating witnesses were compromised. What is not contested is the conviction, which stands in the record as the documented outcome of People versus Luciano, 1936. According to FBI surveillance files and Rab's account, Luciano continued to exercise organizational authority from Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, through intermediaries, Lansky, Frank Costello, and others, who maintained operations and transmitted communications. The commission structure he had built in 1931 was sufficiently distributed that his incarceration did not collapse it. The United States government made contact with Luciano through Naval Intelligence Officer Charles Haffenden, documented in Naval Intelligence files and referenced in Rab's account as Operation Underworld, requesting that Luciano use his connections with the New York waterfront to assist with preventing Axis sabotage and supporting intelligence on the Sicilian landing. Luciano cooperated. The precise value of that cooperation is disputed among historians. What is not disputed is that the contact occurred, the meetings took place at Dannemora, and the cooperation was considered real enough that New York Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had prosecuted Luciano, commuted his sentence in 1946 on the condition that he accept deportation to Italy. The man Dewey had sent to prison for 30 to 50 years walked out after 9 years, having kept his organization intact from a prison cell and having negotiated his own release through a wartime arrangement with the United States government. Number 1. He was deported, built an international criminal network from exile, and died before the government could touch him again. On February 9th, 1946, Charles Luciano boarded the SS Laura Keene at Pier 7 in Brooklyn under INS escort and was deported to Italy. He was 48 years old. He had not seen Italy since 1907. He would never legally return to the United States. According to FBI surveillance files, Kefauver Committee testimony from 1951, and Rab's account in 5 families, Luciano did not retire. He established himself first in Rome, then in Naples, and built a documented presence in international narcotics trafficking, specifically the heroin pipeline that would become formalized as the French Connection, moving Sicilian processed heroin through Marseille into the American market. The Kefauver Committee's 1951 final report specifically named Luciano as a continuing figure in international narcotics operations despite his deportation. FBI File 92-HQ-1-118 documents ongoing surveillance through the 1950s and confirms active attempts to build a case for extradition. Attempts that failed because Italy's extradition treaty with the United States at that time did not cover the specific charges federal prosecutors were pursuing. Luciano was aware of the surveillance. He gave documented press interviews in Italy throughout the 1950s, denying drug trafficking involvement, at times inviting journalists to observe his daily life in Naples. The FBI files document that he was meeting with figures connected to heroin networks during those same periods. He died on January 26, 1962, at Capodichino Airport in Naples, of a heart attack on the tarmac, while meeting with a film producer documenting his life story. He was 64 years old. The Italian government permitted his remains to be returned to the United States. He is interred at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. The federal government of the United States never convicted him of another charge after 1936. 7 documented facts about the rise of Charles Luciano, a Sicilian immigrant child who arrived in New York in 1907 with nothing. A man who rebuilt his identity, his alliances, and his strategy in ways that the established bosses around him could not match and did not survive. A man who managed a war from both sides of it, built a governance structure designed to outlast any individual, kept his organization running from a prison cell, negotiated his own release through a wartime government arrangement, and ran an international criminal network from exile until his heart stopped on an airport tarmac. It bears stating plainly, the men of organized crime represented a tiny criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. The broader Italian-American community built American cities, served in 2 world wars, founded major industries, and produced generations of citizens who have nothing to do with the conduct documented in this episode. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The Commission files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. New episode next Tuesday. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been The Commission Files. Good night from the archive.